Hey girl, so I have another text that I found really, really interesting that I read for my sociology class, and I just recorded um, a voice note to send you, but it was like super, super long, so I'm gonna try and do it a little bit more concise this time. It's called The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James. I don't know if you know who they are. I don't really know who they are either. I like there was like an assigned reading for them in my history class. I don't really know who they are. The text doesn't really talk about them, but I'm like pretty sure they're like really well known for something. Could not tell you, unfortunately, but yeah. So, anyways, the text starts by just kind of talking about how Europeans arrived in Africa and started capturing Africans to enslave them and take them to like European countries and the Americas to have them work as slaves, and how they would literally like sell this propaganda that like, oh yeah, life as a slave in America is way better than life in Africa because we actually have civilizations and they don't in Africa. And they were like spreading this idea that it was so much better to be a slave than it was to just be a free man in Africa, which like just goes back to roots of racism and is like super prominent in today's world of like there's like this kind of conflict between Africans and African Americans thinking they're better than Africans. And I don't know, I just found that to be really, really interesting that that was like a huge propaganda back during that time because it's still something that is like commonly believed today. And then the text talks about how Africa was actually like chilling at that time. They had all their tribes, they were happy, there was peace. And when Europeans came to capture all these people, um, all of the tribes kind of broke up. There was a bunch of like destabilized Africans, and they had no tribes. They just had to like look towards violence to like survive. They turned towards slave trade to survive, and just kind of like it kind of threw all of the structure stability in Africa off by capturing all these slaves and breaking up all these tribes. And yeah, then it talks about the journey of enslaved people over to these countries, and how like disturbing and gruesome the slave ships were, and just like I'm sure you've heard about how awful the treatment was, but it just kind of brought that up again. And then it talked about what I found really interesting is like religion, is how when these slaves would arrive at these countries that they were going to be sold off to, once they were purchased by someone, a priest would be brought in to teach them Christianity and like the word of the Christian God and the Christian Bible and whatnot. And I found that really interesting because I know like religion was a huge thing to enslaved people, and like just kind of looking towards a God and praying. But I had never really thought or like questioned Christianity as that religion because obviously Christianity did not come from Africa, and it was not prominent in Africa. And I never really questioned like, oh, where did it come from? And apparently like now I know like it was forced upon these enslaved people that were arriving, and then from there it must have become like generational. But that was like extremely, extremely interesting because religion is such like a huge thing. So I found that really, really curious. But yeah, then the text keeps going and just is talking about like how mistreated the slaves were, how they had to be treated like animals, and how they kept breaking them down in order to prevent like a revolt against the slave owners. And it was just really, really heartbreaking to like think about all this stuff because obviously this is a reality, a history in our world. But it's not something I think about all the time. It's not something that is like brought up all in all of my classes that I talk about all the time. So like being reminded of this past, it's like a lot and it sucks, but it's very, very important to acknowledge it because one of the things in the text is talking about how, quote, there are and always will be some who, ashamed of the behavior of their ancestors, try to prove that slavery was not so bad after all. that its evils and its cruelty were the exaggerations of propagandists and not the habitual lot of the slaves. Like, end quote. And it sucks because we often hear people trying to downplay slavery or trying to compare it to other things like the Holocaust, but there really is no downplaying how awful, how gruesome these people were treated, and how racism continues to bleed into our world and control our world. And it's so important to just literally acknowledge. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging the past and working to change it, but downplaying it isn't going to get us anywhere. It's just going to make matters worse. But anyways, the text keeps going and talking about how slaves were really, really depressed. Obviously, they kind of just shut down. They were really, would just like, I guess the text literally says they would act like stupidly. They would commit suicide a lot. And then another super interesting thing is that apparently slaves were really homicidal. Like, homicidal means like killing other people, I think. And they would use poison. And this is super, super interesting because, like, obviously we know that, like, a lot of enslaved people must have, like, sabotaged their masters, try to, like, get free, try to kill them. But we never really learned the extent of it, or, like, how it was how it happened. And basically the text says, like, they would use poison, the enslaved people, and they would poison the wives of their masters so that their daughters could become the head of the house. They would poison the sons and leave only like the nice son alive, so that when the dad died, he would be the one to take over the plantation. They would like enslave their own children so they wouldn't have to be slaves. They would enslave their wives, their husbands, like, or not enslaved, they would poison all these people, with these intentions of like either helping out the slaves or with preventing their loved ones from being mistreated. And like, even they would go even as far as like poisoning the other slaves to make sure that the master slave owner didn't go and like open another plantation and split everyone up. So I found that super interesting because why are we never taught this type of stuff? Anyways, yeah, so enslaved people, they continue to remain as animals in the eyes of the master. Um, and like, white people really, really had to keep that vision of enslaved people as dumb and as animals so that, enslaved people wouldn't retaliate against them and get too smart and, like, you know, run away or attack them. Um, and then the text goes and starts talking about how there was like a dual personality of the slave, the one they present at work when they're beaten down and mistreated, and then the one when they're with their fellow comrades, and their fellow enslaved black people when they're, resting, relaxing, or trying to find some enjoyment in their life, like dancing, singing. How there's those like two completely contrasting parts of the slave life. It goes to state how plantation slavery was a patriarchal relation between master and slave, which is super complex, but like also like extremely true and very simple, but like you could definitely get into it way, way more. And then yeah, it talked about how there was a lot of slaves who would run away and make their own tribes and then try to retaliate. Once again, something we never learned in school. Um, like, I don't know. I think this was just a huge reoccurring theme in this text, is all stuff we never were taught. Um, but then, yeah, it kind of talks about how slave owners they had a certain rules that the governments made to, like, ensure, like, I guess, an adequate treatment of the slaves, but officials never kind of put into place these laws, were never making sure these laws were being followed. So no matter what the laws said, slaves were still being mistreated. And then it kind of just talks about how that there was so much conflict between slave owners and officials and just like the general slave who were running it, that there was a possibility for emancipation, and that's kind of how it ends off. But anyways, I thought you would find a few of those key things that I talked about like really, really interesting. It just really made me think about all the stuff that we learned in high school and how there's so much unwritten history, or so much that is ignored by the public school system, by the school system in general, that is ignored by the public and social media. And there's just so much that we really don't know and that is not being taught, and there's only one narrative that they're really spreading. So yeah, anyways, I thought you would enjoy that, or not, once again, not enjoy, but just like find it interesting, more knowledge, more information. But yeah, all right, love you, bye.